Good afternoon. Welcome to the CDP webinar, Hurricane Dorian, Next Steps for Philanthropy. This is Tanya Gulliver-Garcia. I'm the Assistant Director of Major Initiatives at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. This webinar has been provided with generous funding from the UPS Foundation and is co-sponsored by Peak Grantmaking, Council on Foundations, Funders Network for Smart Growth and Livable Communities, the National Center for Family Philanthropy, Southeastern Council of Foundations, and Philanthropy New York. Some reminders before we get started. This webinar is being recorded, and it will be available on our website and YouTube channel shortly after the webinar is completed. You can submit questions at any time using the Q&A box, and they will be answered at the end of the panel presentation. If you're on Twitter, please use the hashtag CDP4Recovery to share the discussion. This is the second of two webinars to examine the devastating impact of Hurricane Dorian. In the first webinar, our own team of subject matter experts looked at issues and needs in the Bahamas. And you can access that recording and slide deck on our website under the Resources tab or on our YouTube channel. In this webinar, we will be looking at both the Bahamas and the Outer Banks of North Carolina. Our guest panel will cover the current situation and immediate needs in the disaster-affected areas, the work NGOs, philanthropy, and governments are doing in the impacted areas, what funders should do now and in the next several months to help the recovery process in both locations, and how best to support the unique needs of small islands and small communities in recovery. A few key facts. Hurricane Dorian was one of the longest named storms in the Atlantic, became a named storm on August 24th and dissipated on September 7th. Between 1924 and 2019, there were 35 Category 5 hurricanes in the North Atlantic, and 5 of those, Matthew, Irma, Maria, Michael, and Dorian, have been in the last 4 years. Dorian made 5 separate landfalls, 3 in the Bahamas, 1 in North Carolina, and 1 in Nova Scotia. And it's the 18th storm to make landfall in North Carolina since 1950. Dorian is estimated to have caused $7 billion of damage in the Bahamas. US and Canadian figures are still outstanding. And there have been 50 deaths in the Bahamas attributed to Dorian, with about 1,300 people still missing, and at least 5 storm-related deaths in the US. Now I would like to introduce our guests. Lorelei Costa has served as the Executive Director of the Outer Banks Community Foundation since 2012. With 20 years experience in the nonprofit and philanthropic sectors, Lorelei has worked on diverse projects across North Carolina and Alaska, including past roles with the North Carolina Coastal Land Trust, the Triangle Land Conservancy, and Audubon, Alaska. She's a board member of the North Carolina Network of Grantmakers and recently served on the Community Leadership Council of the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation. Katherine Boatwright is a nonprofit management professional with extensive experience in disaster response, volunteer management, and partnership building. Katherine brings many years of experience in operations, logistics, and program management to the National VOAD, National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters, as their Director of Operations. Doug Stropes is a Humanitarian Policy and Global Engagement Deputy Division Director for USAID's Office of U.S. Foreign Disaster Assistance. And that has to be the longest title, Doug. This is the lead federal office responsible for coordinating the U.S. government's response to international disasters. While at OFDA, Doug has worked on a number of disaster responses, including the 2018 Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the 2015 Nepal earthquake, the 2017 Caribbean hurricanes, the 2017 Mexico earthquake, and the 2018 Venezuelan regional crisis. And finally, last but not least, Regis Chapman is the head of office for the United Nations World Food Program Barbados, overseeing emergency preparedness and response in the Caribbean. He has over 20 years of international development and humanitarian experience, including the past 14 years working with the United Nations World Food Program. So welcome to all of you, and thanks to our panel for taking time away from their work on this disaster to speak with us today. Lorelei, we're going to start with you. So when a disaster hits a very small community like the Outer Banks, and you are a very small organization, what are you doing in the immediate aftermath? And I mean, have you even slept yet?
Hey, thank you for that question. I appreciate it. And thank you very much for inviting me to speak on this webinar. I am humbled to be a part of this panel. And the Outer Banks Community Foundation, we are a very small organization. We have 2 full-time staff and 1 part-time staff. And we've been doing disaster relief for decades in Dare County, but part of our service area also includes Ocracoke. So just to give you a little bit of context, because I love your question. You asked if I had slept yet, and the answer is thanks to Benadryl, yes. But in terms of what we were doing in the immediate aftermath, I just want to kind of paint you a picture. Our county declared a mandatory evacuation in the days leading up to Hurricane Dorian, which I think was very prudent, but I am stupid and stubborn, and so I stayed put. But my other full-time colleague did leave, and I'm also a volunteer firefighter, so immediately after the storm, I was at the fire station. We were clearing trees off of roads and all of that, and starting to get reports that the devastation in Ocracoke, which, as I had mentioned, is part of our service area, was just really extreme. And the winds were still blowing when I was on the phone with my board president and trying to act, really quickly to activate a new disaster relief fund for that area. I guess when you invited me to speak to this group, I think I warned you that it might be a little bit of fly by the seat of my pants, but while I was getting my 3rd dose of caffeine for the day, I was trying to think of 4 pieces of advice that I might share with other very small organizations if they're in disaster-prone areas in terms of being prepared for something like this. And I'll share that with you. One is, especially when you're small, it's so important to get your infrastructure ready. Again, especially if you're in an area that, might get hurricanes or wildfires or earthquakes on a frequent basis. I think that's something that served us really well and helped us move really quickly. So what do I mean by get your infrastructure ready? I have a fabulous volunteer who got a press release ready to go. We had a memo of understanding already in place with a disaster relief partner that would be working directly with hurricane victims in terms of doing outreach and facilitating dollars out to the community. So we already had that in place. We had sort of a board approval process in place. We had already been approved for a Facebook fundraiser. We already had an online donation page for disaster relief. So that's why I mean by getting your infrastructure ready. And that just is so critical if you're a small staff, and especially if one of your staff is evacuated. We were able to move really quickly because of that. That said, my second piece of advice would be nimble. And I think that's easier for those of us that are really small because maybe there are fewer people we have to bring to the table in order to respond quickly. Disasters are really just unpredictable and you don't know exactly what's going to happen. And in our case, with Hurricane Dorian, although we had been doing disaster relief for years in Dare County, as it turns out, the hurricane hit Ocracoke hardest. That's an entirely different county. And my board president and I, as I said, were on the phone while the winds were still blowing and activated that fund. And we were nimble and responsive, and we were able to get that up and running and ready for donations immediately. So again, second piece of advice is be nimble. Third piece of advice when you're small, you need to have some sort of balance of moving fast, but also maintaining your standards. And I think those standards are so important in terms of keeping the confidence level of prospective partners, other funders, other philanthropic agencies, and the community. So I think there's some balance point, and I'm still trying to find that. And maybe when I find that balance point, I'll sleep a little bit more. And my fourth advice, especially if you're a single parent, is fill your freezer with dinners already so that your kid doesn't go hungry. And again, stock up on that Benadryl.
I think that last one is very, very practical. So, you know, the impact in the Bahamas has definitely overshadowed the impact on the Outer Banks in terms of media, what we're seeing. Can you give us an update on the situation there? What are you seeing in terms of an impact?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm again humbled to be on this panel because I know there are folks working in the Bahamas, and the devastation there is just unimaginable for me. I will say that, you know, we had two primary areas of impact. One is Hatteras Island and one is Ocracoke Island. For those of you who don't know the Outer Banks, we're a string of barrier islands off the coast of northeastern North Carolina. And Hatteras Island is a place that gets hard hit storm after storm after storm. For Ocracoke, this was something they haven't seen in 100 years. I mean, it's just catastrophic for that community. Ocracoke is a small island, only 900 full-time residents, and the reports that we've gotten is that 400 homes, so again, 900 full-time residents, 400 of those homes were flooded out. So you can kind of see the level of devastation in Ocracoke, even though we don't have an initial damage assessment yet. Because we don't have an initial damage assessment yet, as of the last time I checked this morning, we still don't have a disaster declaration, and so FEMA hasn't come into play yet in terms of funding assistance. Ocracoke is a community that people love because it's a remote island. You can only get there by ferry or by boat or airplane, and it's one with all mom and pop businesses. It's just this charming village. Because of those small businesses, what we're seeing is that the families there have lost appliances, furniture, cars, medications, their homes, but also their income, where they work. Any place that they were working, those businesses are shut down for the next 6 to 9 months. And so a huge part of our disaster relief efforts is not only helping to rebuild those homes, replace those appliances, you know, do the cleanup work, but also provide assistance to families that have no source of income for the next 6 to 9 months. So we're going to be paying bills that are not necessarily directly related to the disaster, but helping those families get through the winter because there are no more visitors on Ocracoke right now and no time in the foreseeable future. So Dare County has had its damage assessment, and so far it's $15 million in damage. That includes $6.8 million in residential structures. That's just residential structures. That says nothing about, you know, furniture and appliances, wages lost, et cetera. And Ocracoke, again, we don't have those numbers yet, but it's a huge portion of that population that is gravely affected.
Thank you. And it actually sounds like some similarities between the Bahamas and the Outer Banks in terms of location offshore and the tourism economy.
Yeah, I would imagine so. I mean, I haven't spent time on the Bahamas, but there is a dynamic of transportation and storage challenges when it's on a very small island and you don't have all of those resources. We're still trying to get folks back to their homes in Ocracoke. You know, there's all sorts of donated supplies, for example, that are still sitting at the ferry docks that we can't get over. One message that we're trying to get out to the community is that we're welcoming financial contributions, but not necessarily more stuff, because there is such a transportation and storage problem, and there's often a mismatch between, you know, the used clothing that somebody wants to donate and what's actually needed on the ground.
Absolutely, and that's something we see a lot. You know, as a community foundation, you have a sort of unique dual role, because as you mentioned, you're raising funds and you're going to do grant making. So how do you balance those sort of conflicting needs and make sure there's enough resources to support what you're describing, especially from the loss of business, as really an immense ongoing needs for quite a while?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think community foundations do have two roles, grant making and raising funds, but I think that actually puts us in a perfect position after a disaster. I think that's a strength because we have infrastructure on both sides. We have infrastructure to raise funds. We have public charity status. We have relationships with donors. We know how to ask for money. We also have the relationships as a funder for the nonprofits on the ground, and we know how to give out grants. So in addition to the dollars that we've been raising to help full-time residents, individuals, and families, we also have opened a special grant-making cycle for nonprofits on the ground that either are providing disaster relief and need some financial support to do that, or nonprofits that had their facilities damaged or flooded out. For example, you know, a theater on Ocracoke or a museum on Ocracoke, different schools, different historic sites, gardens if they experienced some damage. So yeah, we are playing both sides of the table, and I think that's a real strength for community foundations. Now that said, most community foundations, including ours, really play a role in major gifts, endowment gifts, planned giving. We don't necessarily do a lot of grassroots fundraising, and that's something that we've learned really quickly. I just learned over the past week, you know, how to do a Facebook fundraiser and what goes into that, and that's a different kind of skill set. It's been fun to learn, but yeah, I think community foundations have a wonderful role to play because of the strength on both sides.
Great, thanks so much. We're going to go to Katherine. And I just want to remind our audience that you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to ask Lorelei or any of our panelists a question, and we'll come to those at the end of the panel. So, Katherine, National VOAD works within the United States, and I know at one point, based on my calendar, about 5 different state organizations were holding regular calls to get their state VOADs activated. So can you talk a little bit about the different stages of activity for VOADs, and maybe to start, what is a VOAD?
Sure. Thank you so much, Tanya, and thank you for having me on this webinar. CDP is such a tremendous partner to National VOAD, so we're very pleased to be here. Yes, 5 state VOADs did activate and more for Dorian. So, as you said, a VOAD, that stands for Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. It's a mouthful, so we stick with VOAD. And what that is it's basically just a coalition of disaster relief agencies that coordinate and collaborate together before, during, and after a disaster. Now, I'm a part of National VOAD, which is the national umbrella organization for all these organizations. We represent over 60 national nonprofits that do this work every day. And then we have 55 state and territory VOADs that are basically the more localized structure of what we do on a national level. We're in every state and territory, and they are the entity that really stands up and does the on-the-ground coordinating work that happens after a disaster. Yeah, and as far as the activities that go on, so like you said, it happens 365 days a year. You know, it doesn't matter whether there's a storm in the Atlantic or not. And just having a state VOAD and being a part of one is preparedness in and of itself and getting ready for the next disaster. During the preparedness phase, it's all about getting to know the other organizations that do this work, that are in your community, knowing their capabilities, their capacities, understanding what they can provide, any resources. And this isn't just among nonprofits, this is government partners, this is businesses, this is foundations, and it's all about making those connections so that when the storm does hit, you know exactly who to call to make the response more efficient, because it's all about getting services to the people that have been impacted as fast as possible and as effective as possible. You know, and during the response phase, this same kind of activity goes on, but it's more tactile, of course. You know, each organization has a certain piece of the response that they do, either providing food or water or medical supplies or sheltering, and we all have to participate for that to happen. Not one organization provides all of these services. And so the VOAD is really the place where you come together to share information, share really important intel to say, okay, here's what's happening where, through the communities that have needs. We're seeing a lot of services in this community, but this community is really short on services, so we want to direct some resources there. And it's all about that ever-evolving look at what are the needs, how can we meet them, and are there resources that we need that aren't here today? And as a unit, the VOAD works together to figure that out. And then, of course, with recovery, this is the hard work that goes on for years after a disaster. You know, response is usually between 30 to 90 days, depending on the severity of the disaster, and long-term recovery is just years. You know, that's bringing the community back into wholeness. And, you know, those same agencies that did response, often they do recovery work, and that is putting out the resources to meet those long-term needs, like, you know, rebuilding a home or getting a more permanent job or something, so that the impacts of the disaster aren't affecting their livelihood for the long term, and they're in a sustainable place of wellness after the disaster. You know, response is kind of those immediate needs, and recovery are those harder long-term needs. And the VOAD is trying to connect resources for all of these phases. And, you know, we mentioned earlier that, you know, these states have been impacted multiple times in the past couple of years. And, you know, just to give you a different perspective on it, I was talking to one of our nonprofit members, and not only were they preparing to potentially respond in one of 5 states or multiple states, but they also had volunteers in these states that were doing reconstruction from hurricanes in the past couple of years. So they had to track these volunteers and make sure that they were in a safe place, just in case Dorian did impact those places again. So there's a lot of complexities too with places that are hit multiple times over, because a state VOAD could be in the recovery, the response, and the preparedness phase all at one time if they are in a location that is frequently impacted by disaster.
It sounds like a lot of things to juggle at one time. Lorelei, you know, talked about the impact in North Carolina, and we're going to hear a little bit about the impact in the Bahamas in a minute. But I know some of these organizations work, you know, in North Carolina and are also doing work in the Bahamas. You've touched on the long-term disaster recovery, but what kinds of activities are they likely to do? You know, what does recovery really look like from a voluntary perspective?
Sure. So our nonprofit members who work in recovery, there's a lot of different ways that can look. So as I mentioned, rebuilding homes, helping people find permanent work, refurnishing a home, providing home supplies, furniture, etc. Even in the early recovery, you know, we're probably seeing this in Bahamas and North Carolina, is finding the temporary housing, you know, post-sheltering, but before you can move back home. So hotels, Airbnbs, any kind of long-term rental situation, because we know that after a while, your friends and your family's couch that has a time limit on it. So it's not just that people need housing when the disaster hits, but often 30, 60, 90 years out after, housing is still an issue for people. And then a big part of recovery that people often don't think about is the emotional and spiritual care that's necessary for individuals. You know, we have so many faith-based organizations that do this work, and non-faith-based organizations that do this work as well. But, you know, people who live through the trauma of a disaster and through having their life turned upside down and relocating their family and starting over are often just in the survivor mode for so long. And it's often during that recovery phase, that long, you know, the 9 months after it hits, when maybe they're in an apartment or in some kind of long-term, you know, temporary situation where emotionally, it really starts to take a toll on people. And so it's so important for these organizations to be on the ground providing this mental counseling and wellness that's available to them. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Absolutely. And I mean, I think, you know, you've talked about, and Lorelei talked about the multiplicity of disasters. So I think, you know, I live in New Orleans, and every time there's a storm, that people start thinking about the last storm and what happened.
Right. There's so many triggers and anxieties there that happen for places like that.
Absolutely. And I know at CDP, one of the things we concentrate on in funding is that mental health and trauma support for folks. So the second disaster, Lorelei touched on the boxes that are sitting on the docks because they can't be distributed yet. There's no place to store them. I know people want to help, and I think that's our most basic human instinct, is to do what we can when we see this kind of disaster in the news. What are some of the ways that folks could assist in a recovery effort besides emptying their closet of everything they don't want to wear or don't fit in anymore?
Yes, that's a very important question. I will definitely reiterate what has been said. You know, cash is always best post-disaster. Those financial contributions are the most fluid and effective way to get resources to a community in need. You know, what's happening in our banks right now is a prime example. The Bahamas is getting slammed with this as well, especially when you have port and tariff issues. During Maria, I was quoted, now this is an estimate from a logistician, that the average cost to transport a single bottle of water is $20. When you consider the mode of transportation, the time, the volunteers or staff that it takes to coordinate and to load it and unload it. So it's just such a less effective way of providing services. So I would always say that funding is so important, and so much of the funding comes right after a disaster or as a disaster hits, but often we just don't know the totality of the needs until much later. And so that long-term recovery work that I mentioned earlier of rebuilding, and not just individuals, but communities, schools, parks, theaters, you know, and everything they were mentioning before, that's what puts the community back together again, and that takes a long time. So I would definitely also encourage people to wait. You know, sometimes you can give later, and that is a very good thing. And you can go to our website and VOAD.org, and all of our members are vetted, responsible nonprofits that do this work every day and that are experts. And the majority of them are either working in North Carolina or the Bahamas currently. And that's a great place to start if you're looking for a place to give.
And I would guess that folks could go there too if they wanted to volunteer and get trained and maybe help on the ground themselves.
Yes, of course. Volunteer time is always much appreciated. All of our members are absolutely powered by volunteers, and it's what really makes the difference in being able to deliver these services at all.
Great. Thanks so much, Katherine. Doug, we're going to go to you next and move from the United States to the Bahamas. So can you tell us about the current status on the islands, especially on Abaco and Grand Bahama Island?
Certainly. Thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity to address this important group. I know my introduction there was a bit of a mouthful, but why I'm relevant to this conversation today is that I'm currently serving as the deputy on the response management team, which is the U.S. government's response structure when we respond to crises overseas. So I've been on this disaster since it made landfall in the Bahamas. I certainly would like to extend my own condolences and sympathies, along with those of my colleagues and U.S. government coworkers, to those affected by the hurricane in the Bahamas, Canada, and the United States. As you heard, our team is already working closely with the international community in support of the Bahamian government. So far, the international community has provided over $26 million in humanitarian assistance to the Bahamas. Our disaster experts that we recently deployed report that humanitarians are able to conduct logistical operations in many areas of Abaco, and we're seeing that some of the early recovery and reconstitution efforts have already started in many of these areas. According to the United Nations, most people affected by Hurricane Dorian have already received some form of aid delivered by the humanitarian community, including USAID and the private sector and through individual initiatives. However, there certainly remains pockets, mostly in the isolated areas, that still have significant humanitarian needs. We've noticed in Abaco and parts of Grand Bahama that members of the DART the DART is our Overseas Disaster Assistance Response Team. These are our ones out there doing and finding out what those needs are. We're certainly seeing that shelter, health, and water, along with sanitation and hygiene assessments are still ongoing to figure out what is the best humanitarian assistance, not only the USG, but the international humanitarian community can deploy. And we're certainly seeing that what appears to be the most prevalent need existing still at this time is those surrounding shelter, not only the temporary shelter to help folks get out of the weather, but also more substantial structures for any other storms that may form in the area, and then permanent solutions for them to be able to move back into their communities there. With the response in which was conducted by the government out there started on September 2nd when we did deploy a disaster assistance response team, and it was responsible for coordinating the U.S. government efforts to the area, and they assessed for the priority needs on what was going on out there. The United States has provided $21 million of humanitarian assistance thus far, and this has included funding to the Bahamas Red Cross and the International Federation of the Red Cross Red Crescent Societies. This was designed to provide households and other relief items and support to the World Food Program, which provided 14,000 meals ready to eat, or MREs, and other sorts of food and cash transfers there to provide those immediate food needs in the communities, along with more than 53 metric tons of relief supplies that were deployed from our warehouse in Miami, Florida. In addition to the $21 million that USAID's provided, there's been over $8.5 million of support from the Department of Defense to provide critical logistics support during that time right after the disaster. We've also been working closely with the U.S. Coast Guard, commercial airlines, and the UPS Foundation to airlift nearly 53 metric tons of critical relief supplies from our Miami warehouse to be distributed to the government of the Bahamas National Emergency Management Agency. And some of you may have seen over the weekend, we had another relief flight that was flown by the UPS Foundation as a donation to the U.S. government to move those relief supplies. The Department of Defense has provided transportation to over 120 different missions and also moved over nearly 150 metric tons of relief supplies, including plastic sheeting that is used for temporary shelter to help over 25,000 people, along with 3,000 hygiene kits and water containers to meet the immediate needs of those in the area. You may have also seen that we deployed a urban search and rescue team. This was our internationally certified search and rescue team from Fairfax County, Virginia, which comprised 57 people along with four canines, dogs, and they deployed with over 50,000 pounds of medical equipment and specialized tools that helped in that search and rescue operations, along with assessing the structural integrity of various structures on the area. While they were there, they were able to conduct rescue operations and search more than 900 houses and returned back to the U.S. on Saturday, September 14th. Moving forward, we continue to have a robust presence there with our disaster assistance response team and disaster experts. We'll continue working with partners to provide humanitarian assistance and provide anything that we can in the wake of Hurricane Dorian to support the Bahamian government. So that's our assessment after approaching over 1 week now is that some of the sectors are starting to get needed attention. Well, certainly shelter is the one that we're still really kind of leaning into and trying to figure out how we can help the government there. Thanks.
Well, thank you. It's a lot of moving parts, a lot of stuff, a lot of people. And on our last webinar, my colleague Brennan talked about the challenges of disaster recovery on an island. And, Lorelei touched on this as well with the Outer Banks. But can you talk about some of the challenges you're seeing or that you expect to develop in the Bahamas as the response continues into now I guess the third week?
Certainly. The challenge of being a foreign government responding to a sovereign territory always comes with those unique intergovernmental and government-to-government conversations there on how much do you help the government there and how do you support them as they are responsible for the recovery efforts within their own country there. So we've certainly been working closely with the government of the Bahamas and other departments there to support them in these recovery efforts and working with the United Nations. But most importantly, we've been working with the Bahamian National Emergency Management Agency, which is the equivalent of our FEMA in many ways, to see what those immediate needs are that take place after the disaster. We're at the point now in some parts of this response where we're starting to shift from response to recovery, and my office will transition out of being that lead coordinator, and we'll work with other offices within USAID, the Department of State, and the U.S. government to transition those into the longer-term development activities that will happen there, along with recovery and rehabilitation. But certainly, as Lorelei already mentioned, I want to highlight an often overlooked topic that is really starting to cause concern in the Bahamas here, and that does come with what we call unsolicited donations. And we have staff on the ground in Nassau and Freeport that have noticed not only are these donations that are arriving by the most well-intended and good-natured philanthropic individuals, but they're not requested. There's no distribution network, and they're starting to clog up the ports and starting to become a burden on the relief organizations that are there. We've seen this play out in other responses, and we're seeing it, like I said, real time right now in the Bahamas. Folks have already said that we certainly like to emphasize that the cash is best mentality, model there is best. It certainly allows relief supplies to be purchased in markets closer to the disaster site, which stimulate those local economies, that it's in our best interest to get those local markets back up and running, and it provides employment and generates cash flow for the recovering economies. In addition to the websites that VOAD mentioned there, there's also a list of organizations that are responding to the Bahamas on the Interaction website. That's interaction.org, and also on the website for the Center for International Disaster Information, CIDI.org. And if you click on the Hurricane Dorian response, you'll see a list of organizations that we're aware are working on the ground there and have need for infusions of cash there. So as groups start to try to figure out how they can help at this point in the response and at the request of the Bahamian government, we're trying to message on supporting those organizations that are already responding there. And also unique to this response is, beyond just the individual donations there and response efforts, there's been an overwhelming outpouring of support from the private sector, and this extends beyond traditional corporate support, corporate social responsibility, and we're really appreciative of how responsive the private sector has been and how receptive the Bahamian government has been to working with them. And we're committed in USAID to continue to work with the private sector here to see how we can help ensure that those unmet needs are filled by organizations that are most ready able to do that. If anyone does have additional information about what we're doing with the private sector or our cash is best messaging or how to get involved on the international disaster response, in addition to the resources you've already heard mentioned by the previous speakers, I point you towards the Center for International Disaster Information. We've stood up a call center now that's active from 9 to 5 daily, and that phone number is 202-661-7710, and I'll ask the organizer to share that number along with the websites I mentioned as they send out the meeting notes. So thank you very much for that opportunity.
Thanks so much, Doug. Regis, let's move over to you. What can you tell us about the World Food Programme's role in the response in the Bahamas?
Okay, thanks. Maybe just to start again, to echo the other panelists, I'd like to thank the CDP for inviting WFP to participate in this webinar. And I'm also honored to be part of the distinguished panel. Again, to echo Doug's condolences, obviously, to those affected, not just in the Bahamas, but beyond. So the World Food Program is known around the world for our capacities to quickly, efficiently, and effectively mobilize resources and support for emergency responses. But we do a lot more than just deliver food. We're also the world's largest provider of humanitarian cash transfers that allow populations to recover from shocks with greater dignity and also to better meet their individual needs. We're also the lead within the UN on humanitarian logistics as well as emergency telecommunications. And these capacities are not just to support WFP operations, but also affected countries' government responses, other UN agencies, and international and local NGOs. Following the 2017 hurricane season, just to ground a little bit our support today here in the Bahamas, with Irma and Maria in particular, we were called upon to support in the Caribbean after many years without a major event that necessitated our support. It's a region that for many years has the capability and capacity to manage these sort of events themselves. But 2017 sort of began to reflect the changing picture and landscape of the Caribbean. So we deployed our full array of support to a number of the islands. And as those emergency operations wound down, it was clear that WFP's capacities were missing from the Caribbean. We were then requested by a number of stakeholders to sort of relook at our footprint in the region. And in partnership with the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, or CDEMA, which is a CARICOM entity on disaster management, we opened up an office in Barbados to support emergency preparedness and response in 22 countries and territories in the Caribbean. And I know that it's been a little over 2 weeks since the Bahamas has been hit. Unfortunately, this started as a tropical storm and came over where I live in Barbados. I don't even know how long ago, so I've been tracking this thing, watching it go over Barbados, go through the Virgin Islands, et cetera, and then gain strength. And this past year of engagement that we've had with CDEMA and with countries in the region has really positioned us to better support the Bahamas over these past 2.5 weeks. We deployed a team of 4 experts in food security, logistics, and emergency telecommunications before the storm hit, and this was within a CDEMA-led rapid needs assessment team. And as the storms kind of stalled on top of the Bahamas for a couple of days, it was clear to all at that stage that there was a very high chance of significant damage and devastation. So at that point, we began calling forward additional response capacities and in coordination with the request from CDEMA and the Bahamas National Emergency Management Agency to set up a logistics hub and provide some other assistance. Now, WFP is able to move quite quickly because of these relationships, but also globally, we have a number of internal mechanisms that allow us to advance financial resources. So we are able to move rather than having to wait for contributions to come in. But even with that, we had a significant support from the very onset for this government-led response with the support of USAID's Office for Foreign Disaster Assistance and the USAID Office of Food for Peace. So as Doug highlighted some of the support that they've given to WFP, we've been able to provide nearly 14,000 ready-to-eat meals, which were brought in by air immediately after the storm hit, along with a variety of logistics equipment and supplies. We've been able to establish a logistics hub in Marsh Harbor, which is basically the hardest hit area in Abaco, that includes mobile storage units, warehousing expertise, trucking capacities, and other support, both at the seaport and at the airport. We're also providing a free shipping service for these same actors between Nassau, Abaco, and Grand Bahama. And this is all in place, again, not just for WFP in a response of items that we might move, but really for all the humanitarian partners under the leadership of the government of the Bahamas. Similar, we've helped to get the main government coordination structures in Abaco back online and more efficiently running with support in emergency telecommunications. Many of the humanitarian actors are able to reach the affected population because of this type of logistics support that WFP has been able to put in place. And this buys the response time for, say, the private sector and government structures to come in and eventually rehabilitate and reconstruct some of these facilities.
Great, that's really interesting. And I think we think of World Food Program as just food and don't think about all of the other components of it. Your work specifically concentrates on islands in the Caribbean. So what could you tell us about what long-term recovery looks like on an island versus, a more continental U.S. type disaster?
Well, I think, again, it's first and foremost important to understand the region that we are in and the capacities that exist. And for an agency like the World Food Program, we're better known for our emergency response and significant famines and global crises around the world in contexts like Syria and Yemen, where the numbers of people requiring WFP support are quite staggering. The Caribbean, these events that occur, obviously the impact at the individual household is massive, but the sheer numbers of people affected are much lower than what would traditionally trigger a WFP response. And I think that's changing a little bit. And I really can't underestimate the importance of our host nation partners, the national governments, of SEDEMA and our partners like USAID and from the private sector. This is a region with the strong national and regional capacities in disaster management. And what we're trying to do is really to build on that. And maybe, so we had the UN Secretary General was here over the weekend, and he highlighted basically this triple punch of injustice and saying that, first, the worst impact is on countries with the lowest greenhouse emissions, and the Bahamas is a very good example of that. Second, it's the poorest and most vulnerable people in those countries who suffer the most. And again, we're seeing the same here with communities in the Bahamas. And third, repeated storms trap countries in this cycle of disaster and debt. And this is especially important for small island nations whose economies rely heavily on tourism. So this issue of indebtedness is actually quite important, and I really don't think can be overstated enough. And it's very much a double-edged sword, where many of these small island developing states, they don't have access to certain types of development funds that less developed countries have. So they go into debt in order to fund various programs and priorities aimed at improving the conditions of the poorest and most vulnerable groups of people in their countries. But in the sudden aftermath of a disaster, governments and populations, they suddenly get more attention. They get the support that we're seeing now here in the Bahamas, which is fantastic, but it's often not grounded in some of the local realities. And this indebtedness and the setbacks that the disasters represent. And for example, in Dominica in 2017, estimates are that the country lost 220% of GDP with Hurricane Maria. 220% in the matter of hours is lost. So basically what happens is these events, and we're seeing them at greater severity and more frequently, these superstorms that we're seeing, they're reversing the development gains that have been made over the last 10, 15, and 20 years, and they're essentially increasing inequalities. And again, this is not a continental disaster where you have a much larger country. These island nations, the hit can be that much harder because of the impact that it has on the overall society. So the importance of climate action, emergency preparedness and response, capability building for small island states also needs to be part of that long-term recovery package. We need to better equip countries and regional partners to deal with increasing climate volatility, higher intensity storms, and not just after they occur, but we need to look also beforehand as well. And it's also to remember that it's not just the Bahamas as one country that's been hit. This is a region that's increasingly susceptible to these types of events. And our colleagues at SEDEMA often say that essentially the Caribbean is stronger together than it is a sum of its parts. And it's, I think, important to take the perspective that while today the issue is the Bahamas, tomorrow it could be somewhere else. And the work that we're trying to do out of Barbados with SEDEMA is sort of building on that.
Thanks so much, Regis. I think that's a really important message. I want to move to our questions, and I see that our panelists have been busy answering the questions. So a lot of the questions dealt with organizations who are responding, and I think you've been given some great list ideas, and we will include those on the email that goes out But National VOAD interaction for sure on our website. We also list a couple others that you could go to and find out who's responding. But maybe just want to quickly ask the panel, 1 minute each, as philanthropy, and that's the majority of people who are on this call, what should funders know about long-term recovery in both North Carolina and the Bahamas? What's the sort of one takeaway you'd like a funder to be thinking about? Lorelei, can we start with you?
Sure. Thank you for that question. I want to echo, and I can't remember who said it earlier on this call, but this is the long haul. I think, with our news cycle already, just one county over, I feel like, in the Outer Banks, we've already forgotten our neighbors in Ocracoke. And with this news cycle, everybody's already forgotten about Dorian, or not everybody, but lots of folks have already forgotten about Dorian. I think funders need to know that we're in it for the long haul, and recovery will take a long time. And I think, not only do we have to be committed to these communities over the long haul, but I think it's so important that funders be part of this important conversation about, well, what about the next storm? What about the next wildfire? What about the next disaster? How can we make our communities more resilient? And, in some of these hurricane-prone areas, it might be investing in the elevation of some of these homes. There might be a diaspora, some of these communities that have been here for so long, in terms of thinking about, is this the best placement for this neighborhood? These are impossibly tough questions, but, perhaps they're ones we need to address. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Katherine, can we go to you?
Sure. Yeah. I would say that time and time again, after every disaster, I always hear that the outstanding need is housing solutions for people who have been impacted. And especially in these areas that get hit again and again, we hear of people who their house gets destroyed again and again, unfortunately. So how can we build back better and stronger and meet those housing needs? And I would also say give to organizations not just a direct client service, but that they can operate. Give some of those unrestricted funds, because that is what really allows agencies to flex and to move and to hire and to train as they need to.
Great, thank you. Doug, how about you? What should funders know about recovery in the long term?
Certainly, I'll just build on what was already said by the previous two speakers and agree with what they said, but also as funders, as philanthropists, be demanding to the organizations of which you're giving to and supporting. I believe in this time we find too many times there's a pop-up organization, a GoFundMe site that isn't thoroughly vetted, doesn't have a track record, does not have the capacity, and has the opportunity to do a lot of harm on current disasters and those in the future. So I think as you look, as was already said, the needs are going to continue to mount as we get further and further from this disaster. So look at those organizations that are coming together, that are supported by the government and have a plan in place. We've been working strongly with the UN, not only Regis's organization and World Food Program, but also the Office for Coordinating Humanitarian Assistance, OCHA, to work with the Bahamian government and set up that organization that can be that true transparent receiver of funding, but also have that plan to get us through the next phase of recovery and reconstruction thereafter. So be demanding with your dollars as you give them out to folks would be my advice. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. Regis, how about you?
Yeah, thanks. And again, to kind of echo some of the previous comments, I didn't go into the unsolicited items that are coming in, and I can assure you that is becoming a major impediment to the relief efforts here in the Bahamas. So again, this issue of pop-up organizations and unsolicited items, and to echo others' previous thoughts about cash contributions and unrestricted cash contributions are really key. Give to credible organizations that have the expertise to do that. And I think one last message is really this emphasis on helping the Caribbean to strengthen their climate resilience. And just over the course of the past few hours, if you look online, you'll see that we now have a tropical storm Imelda nearing the Texas coast. There was a weather system that's several days out from the Caribbean that just developed this morning into a tropical depression and expected to strengthen to a hurricane later this week as it comes, more closer to the small Caribbean islands in the Eastern Caribbean. And at WFP, we're raising funds for these broader efforts of WFP's work throughout the Caribbean, again, to strengthen host government and regional bodies' capacities around emergency preparedness and response, and linking government social protection programs with humanitarian assistance so that we don't all the time need to create parallel structures to respond, but really how can we build on what governments already have in place, and then of course climate adaptation. Thanks.
Thank you. So we are coming to the top of the hour, and I'm going to wrap up. I want to say that as of this morning, our friends at Candid, which used to be the Foundation Center, told us that $42,925,000 has been donated by private institutional response to Dorian. So family philanthropy, corporate philanthropy, community foundation. So almost 43 million. This is more than double, almost triple the amount from last Monday when we did our first webinar. So we're really seeing some rapid growth. I think they said there's been 18 $1 million or more dollar donations. As our panelists have shared, there's going to be ongoing needs to assist with recovery for many years to come. We have our own hurricane season recovery fund that gives money to these organizations that are on the ground doing this work. So if you need to make your pledge now but want it to be saved for 6 months, 9 months, a year, that's one option for you. And you can get more information on our website. And then if you're thinking about planning disaster response funding, if you need resources, if you need information, I want to direct you to the Disaster Philanthropy Playbook, which has a number of toolkits and resources to guide the philanthropic community in responding to future disasters. And as Lorelei said at the very beginning with her first lesson, getting your infrastructure in place is really important. And the Disaster Playbook can definitely help you do that. It's a free resource for everyone on the call. So I want to thank, of course, our wonderful panel, Lorelei, Katherine, Doug, and Regis, for taking their time to share their insights, and especially for taking time away from their work on the disaster. Thanks again to the UPS Foundation, our wonderful hosts for this webinar, and to our co-sponsors, the Council on Foundations, Peak Grantmaking, the Funders Network for Smart Growth and Livable Communities, Southeastern Council of Foundations, the National Center for Family Philanthropy, and Philanthropy New York. And thank you to everyone who has joined us. If you have any questions or thoughts that were not addressed during today's webinar or that you think of after, please give me an email. You can see it there on the screen, tanya.gulliver-garcia@disasterphilanthropy.org, and have a great afternoon.